Red leather, yellow leather, red leather, yellow leather. Pitter patrol on a spittle on a raindrop devil. Okay. What's up, hard chargers? What is up? Welcome back to another episode of Hodgepodgepreneur with me, Kyle Miller. And on this episode, we're going to talk about rental properties. And I don't think I've ever mentioned it on any of my other episodes, and I don't know why, but I have pretty extensive knowledge in the way of rental properties. So this is a show about business, but I do know that some people like to get into real estate as part of diversifying their portfolio, whether it is for their business or for their personal use, or if they want to start a business using real estate. And that is what I did. When I got out of the military, I started a business in property management where I managed rental properties for absent owners, reluctant owners, and investors. And so I did that for 5 years. And at my peak, I had 103 properties under management. And that included anything from Section 8 HUD housing, luxury homes, vacation rentals. I had a doctor who had a really nice in-ground saltwater pool type vacation rental. All this was down in South Carolina. And we also managed single family homes and multifamily homes. So I did the whole gambit. And I did that for 5 years. And like I said, at my peak, I had 103 under management. When I say property manager, the basic job of the property manager is to collect rents, to find tenants and screen those tenants, to make sure that tenants move out when they're supposed to and new tenants go in there, to handle the eviction process as much as they can, state dependent, of course. Some states require that you use a lawyer, or some states require that the owner be there. And then the last thing they do is they handle maintenance requests. So we'll field those maintenance requests, make sure that insured, qualified maintenance folks go out and that they do perform the job that they were supposed to both the tenant satisfaction and the owner's satisfaction. So in a nutshell, that is what a property manager does. So in this episode, I'm going to talk about the top things I learned in no particular order while managing over 100 rental properties for 5 years. Starting with this. If you're going to own a rental property, okay, if you're going to own a rental property, you need to own more than one rental property, and you need to figure out what your niche is going to be. Unless you have a lot of money to diversify your niche, meaning like if you're going to do low income and you're going to do high income, or if you're going to do beach rentals and high income, if you have enough money to diversify that, great, good on you. Most people don't. So if you're getting into this game, I would recommend figuring out what niche you want to be in first. And here's what I mean by niche. Mobile home parks are one niche, right? Like if you have a mobile home park and you're renting out the lot to the mobile homes for them to be placed there, that is a totally different eviction process. That is a totally different collection process. There are totally different rules of what you can and can't do in that regard versus if it was an actual property that you were renting out to somebody. The other type of niche could be vacation rentals, like I was talking about. Vacation rentals can be very cumbersome because there's a lot of tenant changeover because one person gets out of there on Wednesday at 11, the next person is checking in Wednesday at 3. So that's a totally different niche. Then you have the single family homes, which are not located in one general area like a multifamily home is. So a multifamily home, you may have 4 units, all in the same county, all in the same school district, all on the same street, all under the same jurisdictions. And that makes it pretty easy to know all of the little quirks inside of that area. I know guys who own rental properties inside of areas, and they know all of the judges who perform the evictions, the magistrates. They know all of the lawyers who operate in that area. They know everything about the school districts. So it's very easy for them to answer questions. It's very easy for them to navigate the internal politics of that area. Whereas if you have a single family home in one county, and then 5 minutes away, there's another county that you have a single family home, and then 30 minutes up the road, another one. Now they're all dispersed and it's a little bit different, but maybe you can command higher rents. So with that being said, whatever niche you go into, just know that there are particular quirks within that niche that make it very difficult if you're going to own a vacation rental and then go own a multifamily rental and then go own a single family rental. Okay, so just be careful on that. I know that diversification is always the name of the game, but there's something to be said for that consistency. The other thing I'll say is you want to own more than one rental property if you're going to own a rental property. So if you're going to own a rental property, you need to make sure that if that rental property goes vacant, or if there's a huge maintenance issue with that rental property, or if that property is having to have an eviction performed on it and it's not vacant, but you're also not getting rent and it's under an eviction process, it's always good to have the other property propping up the losses on the one that is currently vacant and not yielding any kind of money. And so let me give you an example. My wife and I we did have 3 rental properties. Now we're down to 2. One was in Arkansas, one was in South Carolina, and one is in New Jersey. And I know I just told you not to do something like that, but I was in the military, so what are you going to do? I picked one up everywhere I PCS. So what we experienced last year was that the New Jersey property needed a new roof on the back end, which cost $1,600. It was a small house, small roof, so it only cost us $1,600. Right after we put that roof on there, the South Carolina house went vacant. Somebody completely moved out on us, skipped rent for the month of November, and we had to get it turned over. And that's really difficult to turn over in these holiday months, November, December. People aren't wanting to move during Christmas and Thanksgiving and in the cold. So while that one was vacant, the New Jersey house propped that one up. And while the New Jersey house was getting maintenance done, then the South Carolina house propped that one up. So that's what I mean by having more than one rental property in order to help one out while the other one is hurting. The second thing I will say is you need to know inside and out the Landlord Tenant Act or the Landlord Tenant Law in your particular state. So the Landlord Tenant Act or the Landlord Tenant Law in every state varies pretty drastically. The eviction process, for example, the notice process in South Carolina is way different than one in Ohio. In South Carolina, you don't have to give a notice to the tenant if you write the notice in the lease. So if you have the proper verbiage in the lease, which is found in the Landlord Tenant Law, then you are able to put that into the lease, and if somebody needs to be evicted, you are no longer required to give them first notice. That serves as first notice. In the state of Ohio, you have to post the notice. So there's two different things there. So the Landlord Tenant Law, the Landlord Tenant Act in your specific area will do two things. It will let you know what your rights are as the landlord, and it will let you know your obligations as the landlord. And by knowing your obligations and what you're obligated to do will also, by default, tell you what you don't have to do. So if a tenant tries to tell you, you do have to do this because if I burn up, you're in trouble, or you do have to do this because if somebody gets hurt, you're in trouble. You don't have to, especially because in the Landlord Tenant Acts, a good one usually will tell you what you are not required to do as well. So, for example, in the state of South Carolina, you had a notice to cure. So anytime a tenant would give you a notice that fire alarms specifically were not in the house, you had so many days to cure that. I believe it was 11 days to cure that. Also in the state of South Carolina, you have a 5-day grace period before you can start the eviction process. In Ohio, it's different. In Arkansas, it's different. All these states vary, and it's all according to their own landlord-tenant laws and their own landlord-tenant acts. So make sure you read that so that you know what you can and can't do and what the tenant should be and should not be allowed to do. Time frames, all of those things are all found within the landlord-tenant laws. Another thing is, if people come from out of state, so I had this happen all the time. In South Carolina, where my property management company was located, we had a lot of military folks in there. We had a lot of folks come transient through for like Bosch and Boeing and some of the bigger organizations around town. And what they would do is they would bring with them their remembrance of laws in states they had been to before. So people would move there and they would quote a law to me that they knew from Texas. And they probably didn't even know the law. They just heard it around there. And it may even be a law, but they tried to get me to act within the laws of some state that they heard of somewhere else, thinking that landlord-tenant laws are universal. And that's just not the case in all instances. The third thing I'll say is consistency equals efficiency. So consistency is very important whenever you're managing multiple rental properties, especially if you're managing more than 2 or 3 rental properties. Because what happens is if you start to make a favor for one person over here, even though it had good intentions, even though it had the right reasons behind it, even though it actually helped that individual, if you start making exceptions over here and you don't do it for these other ones. So let's say you had 4 rental properties, you make an exception for one person over here on their move out procedures, and you didn't make that exception for these other 3. That can be misconstrued as you being specifically racist or gender specific or familia specific. People will start to interpret that to be that you are violating one of the protected classes and that you are discriminating. So make sure that if you require 5-day notice, that you require 5-day notice for everybody, and don't ever bend that. If you're going to bend it, then you need to change it permanently. And then if you're going to change it back, you need to document those things in writing so that you can show when you decided and what made you decide on how to do business. Consistency will equal efficiency, because if you are doing screening one way for this tenant because it's convenient for them, and then one way for this tenant because it's convenient for them, and one way for this tenant, before you know it, especially if you have 100 properties under management, or if you have 20 properties that you own or 10 properties that you own, before you know it, you have all these what I call crack deals worked out in the background where you're doing a little bit of this for this person, you're allowing this person to do a little bit of that. This person is mowing the yard, so you're knocking $25 a month off their rent, but it's nowhere in the contract. and before you know it, you just have a whole mess. So just be consistent with everything you do. It protects you legally, and it makes you more efficient on the operation side. The fourth thing I will say is document, document, document. Okay? You cannot document enough most times. So anytime you go to court, and it is a civil matter between a landlord and a tenant, usually the bar set in the legal system at that point is a preponderance of the evidence. Now, I'm not a lawyer, I'm not giving you legal advice on any of this, but a preponderance of the evidence basically means more likely than not. Now, a lot of people think that if you didn't get them on videotape, if you didn't get them on audio recording, if you didn't take fingerprints, if you didn't have them come in and do ballistic analysis, then you are not going to have a leg to stand on in court. And that's just not the case. In a court, the judge is going to go off of what's more likely than not. And it starts with the person who is suing. So if you are the plaintiff, then the judge says, hey, what's your complaint? What are you suing this person about? You give them what you are suing about and the supporting evidence for that. And then the ball goes over to the defendant. And the judge says, hey, here's all the evidence that they gave me. Here's what they just said. Now, what's your counter to that? Then they are to provide evidence and provide their reasoning against it. And then it shifts back to the plaintiff and back and forth until finally the judge makes a decision. And so I've been in those cases many a times. My employees have been in those cases many of times. And documentation is the thing that saves us, because by documenting it, it is now the tenant's word against our evidence. And the evidence doesn't have to be stone cold, hardcore, fingerprint and notarized stuff. It can be more likely than not. So inside of the platforms we use, there are things out there called AppFolio or Propertyware. These are different property management platforms that you can go out and buy or purchase a subscription to. Inside of there, we would document everything. We would text tenants, we would email tenants, and all of it would be captured inside of there. If we had a phone call with the tenant, we would leave a note in the system. That note had a date and time stamp on it, so that way we could see that. So we're creating this trail that tells a story. We called him on this date. We text him on this date. We came in there to talk to him on that date. And you create that story. But then also what that does is it creates a timeline, because that timeline is important in a lot of instances for when the eviction process starts, when somebody moved out, what time that starts. Clocks are a big deal in the management of rental properties. Whenever it is a landlord and a tenant dispute, the timing of everything is usually a big deal. So if a tenant gives you a notice to cure something, it is important that you document the time and date that they gave you that notice, for example, because now you may only have so many days to cure that or to make reasonable efforts to cure that. Likewise, if you give a tenant a notice to cure something, they have so many days to do that before you can start the eviction process. So if you're starting the eviction process, the judge is likely going to ask, okay, when did you tell them about this and what did they do? We even documented when we showed a property. And the reason I found that came in handy is because people tried to sue us sometimes when they moved out of a property early, and they were moving out because they were deadbeats and they were trying to dodge rent or anything like that. What they were doing was they had a new job offer in another state that they just couldn't turn down, and it was 4 months prior to the ending of their lease. Well, the owner still needs rent for that time, and in the state of South Carolina, just for example, you're allowed to continue to collect rent until you rent the property, but you as a landlord have to make a reasonable effort. And the word reasonable is up for interpretation. And guess who gets to interpret that? The judge. And so you need to help the judge see that you're being a reasonable person with this documentation. And the tenant is going to try to convince the judge that you weren't being reasonable because here's what they would do and here's what a reasonable person would do. We were able to show documentation of when we showed the property, who we showed the property to, why they didn't want it, people who applied, why they were denied. And we were able to put a picture together that showed that we made as much of a reasonable effort as any person could. But again, that comes back to documentation, documentation, documentation. And the last thing I'll say is that vendors can make you look bad. Vendors can actually hurt you. They could even put you out of business. And a vendor is somebody who goes in to do work in a property for you. There are some things you have to look for. Vendors, you have to keep in mind, have to be super trustworthy because they are going into properties where the tenants are not at. If you think about this, during the day, when I was managing properties, my job was to manage properties, but the tenant's job was to go to work. So they would go to work, and during that time, that is when the vendors are coming in to make the repairs. Well, I had a lot of times where the tenant said, I don't feel comfortable with a vendor coming, or I want you to be there with the vendor. And at first I was like, that makes sense. I would want that too. So I would go over there and I would sit there while the vendors are doing the work. Well, you can't do that when you have 100 properties and you have all these maintenance requests going on for all these properties. You can't be at all of them. So finally I thought to myself, well, if you own the property, would you take off work to be there? More than likely, you probably would not. more than likely you would go ahead and go to work. You would tell the vendor the keys under the doormat, go in and do your thing because you trust that vendor. Well, I trust these vendors. I vet these vendors. I make sure they have insurance. I make sure they have references. I start to do small jobs with them, and then I work them into the bigger ones. Now, you have to remember that these vendors are going into properties that have prescription drugs sitting around. They have electronics sitting around. They might have firearms sitting around. So there is a huge potential and liability that if somebody went into a property unattended, that they could steal something and nobody would know. Or if they did know, there would be no proof that they took it. And so you always want to get a vendor that you can trust. Vendors who are going to go into a property where there is a child there and no adult, and a child would be described as anybody under the age of 18. You don't want that going on. I always tell my vendors, don't go into a property if there's somebody underage there. Don't even do work outside of the property. Even if you are going to cut a tree down, knock on that door, make sure nobody's there. If nobody's there, then you can do the work. If somebody is there and they're underage, then you need to leave and we'll come back another time. I had an employee tell a vendor one time they weren't specific enough. They weren't specific enough in the scope of work, and I had a employee tell a vendor, mulch as needed. Well, when you tell a landscaper to mulch as needed, that is pretty subjective. That is up to a landscaper's interpretation of where the mulch is needed. And so, long story short, something that should have cost about $100, he was charging us $750 for. And I don't blame the vendor. I don't blame the homeowner. I don't blame the tenant. I blame us. I blame me. I blame my employee. I should have taught them better. They should have known better. So I will say that vendors can be the bane of your existence. They can make you look bad. So just be careful with what vendor you send out there and make sure that you're specific in the scope of work that they're going to do. I always like to put a limit on them that says, and I give them the work order in writing. Even if you are doing this for your own properties, you want to make sure that either you or the vendor have put something in writing that you guys both understand definitions and what some type of subjective thing is. But what I like to do is I like to put a limit on them, and I say, okay, you can perform this work, and I describe the scope of work for up to the agreed price or up to $350 or whatever the price might be. And if you're going to go beyond that, you must call and get permission first before moving on. So there are my top lessons learned from managing 100 rental properties. And again, a lot of this stuff is state specific. A lot of this stuff is niche specific. So just make sure that you do your research before you get in on it and talk to a lawyer. I'm not a lawyer. I am a licensed property manager in the state of South Carolina. I've had a license in Ohio for real estate. My mom is a broker in Arkansas. My business partner was a broker in South Carolina. So I've been surrounded by and had a lot of experience with property management. So there are my tips for managing rental properties. If you like this, give me a thumbs up. And if you manage rental properties yourself and you got a good story, leave me one down below. Every good landlord has a good story. And I tell you what, as the audience, I'll make you a deal. If I get 30 likes on this video, I will tell you about a debate I had to have between a tenant and a landlord about whether or not it was legal to bury a cat on his property. So make sure you hit the subscribe button. Make sure you hit the bell so you get the notifications. And I'll see you next time on the next episode of Hodgepodgepreneur. Keep charging hard, hard chargers.